Sometimes I think that if I were given a chance to go back in time and make things right, I would still make the same mistakes. Not because I want to hurt, but because something inside of me longed for the freedom I felt, but realized its price too late. Every day I wake up in an empty house, surrounded by silence. On the floor lies Tommy's teddy bear, his favorite toy that was always by his side. I can still hear his voice, see him laughing when Mark tossed him in the air. These memories torment me, making every minute a torture, but worst of all are the pictures on the walls. Each photo is like a reminder of who we were, a happy family full of love and trust. Now it's all gone. All that's left is emptiness and despair. When I met Mark, I was still very young and naive. I thought life was a book with every page planned out in advance. We were students, poor but happy. Our first dates were in cheap cafeterias where we could only afford coffee and one dessert for two. I remember one day he brought me a small bouquet of wildflowers. He picked them himself because he couldn't afford to buy something more expensive. "I know they're not roses," he said with an apologetic smile. "But you like simplicity, don't you?" I laughed, and then I cried. It was the first time I'd ever felt someone truly understood me. Our wedding was small, but perfect. I still remember us dancing to an old song that our DJ randomly chose. "Are you sure you want to spend the rest of your life with me?" I asked him, smiling. "More than sure, Laura," he answered. He'd always been like that, confident, trustworthy. I felt safe with him, as if the whole world could fall apart, but he would always be there to support me. But somehow, over the years, that feeling changed. With the birth of Lisa and then Tommy, our lives became like an endless cycle of worries, sleepless nights, getting ready for school in the morning, work, dinners, and sleep. It was all wonderful, but exhausting at the same time. Mark continued to be the perfect husband. He worked overtime so we could afford a new car, but always made time to spend an evening with the kids. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that they were the ones he loved most in life. "Do you know I'll always be there for you, Laura?" he said one evening as I sat tiredly on the couch after a long day. "Yes," I answered, but somehow I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me was already cracking. When Mark had told me that his brother Jake was back in town and wanted to stay with us, I'd been alarmed. "You know what he's like, Mark," I tried to argue. "You said yourself that he couldn't control himself, Laura. It's just for a couple of weeks until he gets settled. Besides, he's my brother," he said calmly, not noticing my concern. When I'd first seen Jake, I'd realized why he'd often been compared to Mark. They were similar in appearance, tall, blonde hair, brown eyes. But there was something wild about Jake, like he never obeyed the rules. His smile was dangerous, like a man who knows what attracts people and takes advantage of it. Why did I start looking at Jake differently? I couldn't figure it out myself. Perhaps because he was something Mark could never be. Whereas Mark lived by the rules, Jake lived as he wanted. It was appealing, but it was also scary. Every time he stopped his gaze on me, I felt awkward. But at the same time, deep down, it flattered me. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to stop those thoughts. What's happening to me? Why can't I have enough of what I have? I loved Mark, but there was an emptiness growing in my soul that I couldn't explain. One evening, when Mark was on the night shift and the kids were asleep, Jake came into the kitchen where I was sitting with a cup of tea. "You look tired," he said. "All moms look tired," I replied, trying to avoid his gaze. "But you're not like the others." The words made me look up at him. There was something in his gaze that made me feel vulnerable. "You deserve better than that, Laura," he added quietly. I didn't know what to say. He leaned closer, and I felt my head spinning. "Stop it, Jake," I said, standing up, but he didn't stop. His words and touch shattered the last barriers I'd tried to keep in place. After that night, I began to remember more and more moments when I compared Mark and Jake. Mark was caring, but sometimes too predictable. Jake, on the other hand, was full of surprises. "Do you love me?" Mark asked me one night. "Of course I do," I answered. After that night with Jake, I was afraid of myself. Every time I looked into Mark's eyes, I could feel the wall between us growing higher. He didn't suspect a thing. In his eyes, I was still Laura, the wife, the mother, the woman he trusted more than anyone else, but there was a battle going on inside me. how could I do that to him? Those words echoed in my head every time he took my hand or hugged me, but next to the guilt came something else, something I couldn't ignore. Jake awakened a part of me that I'd long forgotten about. He made me feel alive. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop it. What was it that I was missing? I tried to figure out why this was happening. With Mark we always had stability, but maybe that was the problem? He never doubted me, never looked at me like I might disappear. Everything was predictable, calm. With Jake, it was different. In his presence, I felt like someone else. The memories of that night never left me, making me both terrified and strangely painfully eager to do it all over again. What's wrong with me? Why can't I be happy with someone who does everything for our happiness? Why am I reaching for something that will destroy everything we've built? To drown out the guilt, I often went back to memories of our early years with Mark. I tried to figure out exactly where I had lost myself. One day I remembered our first major argument. It was a few months after Lisa was born. I was exhausted, we barely had time for each other. Why don't you ever ask me how I'm feeling? I exclaimed at the time, Laura, I'm working my ass off so we can have a normal life. He snapped at me. Do you have any idea how tired I am? That was the first time I felt alone in our marriage. Of course, we made up, and he apologized sincerely, but the feeling remained. Now, years later, I realized that our love had slowly become a comfortable habit. Jake wasn't going to stop. He came closer and closer, knowing I wouldn't be able to resist. One evening, when Mark was late at work again, he came over to me, holding a glass of wine. You realize I think about you every day, right? He said quietly, you have to stop, Jake. I tried to argue, but my words were unconvincing. Can you honestly tell me that you don't think about me? I didn't say anything. The question hung in the air, making me clutch my glass so tightly I was afraid I'd break it. A few days later, Mark suggested we have a family dinner to thank Jake for his help with the kids. It was just another act of kindness that only made me feel more guilty. I cooked everything, trying to look as calm as possible, but Jake kept catching my eye. You're a great cook, Laura, he said at the table, and there was an undercurrent of mockery in his voice. Thank you, I replied, trying not to meet his gaze. Mark didn't notice anything. He was laughing, telling stories about his childhood and genuinely happy that his brother was finally back in the family. That night, I could hardly keep from crying. Why did everything go wrong? I remembered the moment when Mark and I had first moved into the house. We'd walked through the empty rooms, discussing where the furniture and cribs he'd made with his own hands would go. We'll be happy here, Laura, he said then, and I believed it. I really believed that this house would be a place where we could raise children, create memories. But why did every room now feel like a prison, with walls pressing in on me from every side? One night when Mark came home from work, he sensed something was wrong. You're different, Laura. What's wrong? It's okay, Mark, I answered quickly, but he didn't believe me. Look, if something's wrong, you can tell me. We're partners, he said with the same kindness that had always been his forte. I nodded, but the words stuck in my throat. How can I tell you the truth? It would kill you, and us. But how long can I hide it? I realized our relationship was snapping at the seams. Every encounter with Jake added fuel to the fire. Mark kept trusting me, and I kept lying to him. One day I overheard Jake talking to the kids. When I was little, I used to be jealous of your daddy, he said to Lisa. He always had everything better. Those words made me wonder. Was this all just Jake wanting to prove to Mark that he could take everything away from him, even his wife? If that's the case, then I've ruined my life for his game. But if that's not true, why do I still want to be with him? After those events, I felt imprisoned by my own choices. It seemed like every day became an endless struggle with myself. On the one hand, I knew I had to end things with Jake, to break that destructive bond. On the other, his presence in the house was becoming an addiction. I tried to avoid him, but it was impossible. He lived under the same roof as us. Any glance from him, any casual touch, revived the memories of that night that I'd tried in vain to get rid of. Mark didn't notice anything. He continued to be a caring husband and father, unaware that his world was cracking at the seams. It was like I was living two lives. In one, I was a loving mother and wife, fulfilling my responsibilities. In the other, I was drowning in the chaos of my feelings and desires that were tearing me apart from the inside out. Every night, as I lay in bed next to Mark, I could feel the guilt growing inside me. He didn't deserve this. He was too good for me, too decent to suspect that his wife could have fallen so low, but why couldn't I stop? Why was it that every time I saw Jake, I lost control of myself? Could it be because I had already crossed that line beyond which it was impossible to go back? One night, when Mark had left for the night shift again, Jake came up to me. This time I tried to walk away from him, but he didn't give me the chance. "Laura, you think you can just ignore me?" His voice was quiet, but he sounded threatening. "Jake, stop it. It was a mistake." "A big mistake," I said, trying to walk away, but he grabbed my arm. "A mistake? Does this look like a mistake to you?" He stared into my eyes. "You know I won't back down." I felt the walls of the house start to press against me. I wanted to scream, to kick him out, but I couldn't. Instead, I remained silent as he continued to advance, breaking down the remnants of my will. A few days later, I noticed that Mark began to behave strangely. He would often linger in the room with his laptop, looking at something he wasn't showing me. I could see him frowning, like he was putting together some pieces of a puzzle. "Is everything okay?" I asked him one evening. "Yes," he answered briefly, not looking up at me. That yes sounded cold, like an icy knife cutting through the silence between us. I lay in bed for a long time that night, wondering if he knew. I remembered a conversation Mark and Jake had overheard a few years ago. It had been at a family dinner when Jake hadn't moved in yet. "You know, you were always the favorite," Jake said, grinning, but there was bitterness in his voice. "Come on, Jake," Mark said. "You always wanted freedom, and I was just doing what I had to do." "Yeah, sure, you're the perfect son, the perfect husband. Everything about you is perfect, isn't it?" I hadn't paid attention to those words at the time, but now they resurfaced in my mind, colored with new meaning. My close friend, Sarah, noticed something was wrong with me. "Laura, you look terrible. You can tell me what's going on, can't you?" She asked me one day over a cup of coffee. I looked at her and I wanted to tell her everything. About Jake, about how I'd betrayed Mark. But instead, I said, I was just tired. The kids, the house, work. "You know how it is." "I know," she replied, but her gaze was full of disbelief. Friendly advice that I didn't hear. Sarah was always wiser than me. She often told me that the most important thing in marriage is trust. But what would she say when she learned the truth? She would have turned her back on me. As Mark would have done. I was afraid of her judgment. Afraid she would see me not as a friend, but as a woman who had destroyed her family. So I kept quiet, continuing to lie to everyone around me, and myself first. One evening Mark came home earlier than usual. I was sitting in the kitchen, trying to calm my trembling hands, when he walked in. "We need to talk," he said in a serious tone. "About what?" I tried to look calm, but my heart was racing. "About Jake." Those two words stabbed me like a knife. "What's wrong with him?" My voice shook. "You think I don't notice? You think I'm blind?" His voice grew louder and louder, and I realized it was over. I remembered a moment when things might have been different. When Jake had first arrived, Mark had asked me if I was comfortable with his brother staying with us. Of course I was comfortable, I'd said, not realizing what it would mean. I realized now that I could have stopped it in the beginning. "You betrayed me, Laura," Mark said, his voice filled with pain and rage. "I trusted you. I protected you. And you betrayed me with my own brother." "Mark, I started, but he interrupted me. "Don't say anything. You ruined our family." He got up and left the room, leaving me alone in a silence that seemed deafening. When Mark left, I was left sitting in the kitchen as if paralyzed. I knew he knew, and it was even scarier than I could have imagined. It was getting dark outside the window, but I didn't turn on the light. Everything around me seemed as empty as I was inside. I tried to find the words to explain to him, but I realized they didn't exist. My mind flashed through all the times he'd been there for me, supporting me, protecting me, even when I didn't believe in myself. How could I have let him down like that? I remembered our first kiss. It was in college, on an evening walk along the lake. Mark had been hesitant to admit his feelings for a long time, and when he finally took my hand, I realized that this was the man I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. "I want to make you happy, Laura," he said then, and he kept his promise, but the happiness he'd spent years building, I destroyed in one night. A few hours after I'd talked to Mark, Jake walked into the kitchen. His self-assurance irritated me. "So, what now? He kicked you out?" he asked with a sneer. "You don't realize what you've done, Jake." I shouted, "It wasn't me, Laura. It was us. You made your own choice." His words hit me like a hammer. He was right, but that only made me angrier. "You used me to prove something to your brother," I hissed. "Maybe, or maybe you used me to escape from your boring life." I couldn't take it anymore and slapped him across the face. "Get out of my house, Jake," he smirked, wiped the blood from the corner of his lips, and said quietly, "It's not just your house, Laura." I woke up the next morning to the sound of a slamming door. Mark was nowhere to be found. In the bedroom, it looked as if he had disappeared in an instant, taking the essentials. The children, sensing the tension, looked at me with questions in their eyes. "Mommy, where's Daddy?" Lisa asked. I tried to smile, but my hands were shaking. "He's away on business, sweetie." But even she, being a child, realized I was lying. A mother who had failed, I ruined not only my marriage, but also my children's family. They will never know what it's like to grow up in a home where there is love and respect. Lisa looked at me with her big eyes, and I could see the misunderstanding and pain in them. Her world was falling apart and I was the cause of it. How can I look at them now, knowing that I broke their future? The next day I received a text from Mark. "I'm taking the kids. You are not worthy to be their mother." Those words tore at my heart. I understood his anger, but I couldn't let him take Lisa and Tom away from me. I wrote to him, "Mark, let's talk. You can't just disappear." His reply was short and icy, "We'll talk in court." I turned to Sarah again, this time determined to be honest. "I cheated on Mark with Jake," I told her. She was silent for a long moment before she answered, "Laura, I can't judge you, but you have to understand that everything depends on how you act now. He wants to take the children, and you're surprised?" Her words were harsh but honest. A few days later, Mark filed for divorce and child custody. It was a blow, but an even bigger blow was when Jake offered to help. "If you want, I can testify against Mark," he said. "Are you serious? You think I want to be with you after all this?" Jake grinned, as if my words hadn't moved him. "Laura, I'm your only chance, a trust that no longer exists." I remembered the day Mark had first shown me their family home. "This is the place I always wanted to share with the one I love," he'd said then. Now this house was a prison for me and a reminder of betrayal for him. Mark came home a week later to pick up some things. I tried to talk to him, but he was cold and distant. "You broke everything we were building, Laura," he said. "I know," I replied. "But the children will stay with me. After what you've done, you think I'm going to let you raise them?" His words were like a slap in the face. After Mark left, I sat in the children's room, surrounded by Lisa and Tom's toys. Every single thing in the room reminded me of how happy our home had been. Now it all seemed like props from a play that had ended in tragedy. I picked up the teddy bear Lisa adored from the floor. It was old, with a torn seam in the side. I remembered Mark taking a long time to stitch him up one night so Lisa wouldn't get upset. What will I tell her if he takes them away? How will I explain that Mom turned out to be a monster? I remembered an incident that happened a year before we were married. Mark had just started working then, and I'd talked him into taking out a loan to buy a car he'd long dreamed of. But a month later, I spent some of the savings he was saving on a spontaneous trip with girlfriends. He didn't say a word of rebuke then, just quietly added, "Laura, you could have at least discussed it with me." I could see how hurt he was, but he didn't want a scandal, and even then, I was showing him that I didn't appreciate him the way he deserved. Jake tried to talk to me again. This time his tone was serious, without a hint of sarcasm or smirk. "Do you know why Mark never told you about our childhood?" "Because it's his life," I answered coldly. "Because he was always trying to be better than me. Ever since he was a kid, he did everything he could to earn his parents' attention. And I was superfluous." "Are you saying that your problems are the reason you ruined my family?" There was anger in my voice. No. I just want you to understand that Mark will not forgive you. He's always strived for perfection, and you were part of that perfection. And now you're just more proof that perfection doesn't exist. As I listened to him, I realized that Jake was not only destroying my marriage, but Mark himself. Their rivalry had started long before me, but now I was his tool. Jake enjoyed watching his brother's life fall apart. He wasn't just a manipulator, he was a destroyer, but what did that say about me? Was I any better? I let it happen. I opened the door for Jake, let him into my life and ruined everything I cared about. As I tried to think back to the moments that had brought us here, I realized that our problems had started long before Jake. I remembered our first serious conflict. It was a year after we were married, when I wanted to change jobs, and Mark thought it was risky. You take too many risks, Laura, he'd said then, and you always play on the safe side, I retorted. Those words caused a long silence between us. I had thought I was right then, but now I realized that he only wanted stability for both of us. Lisa started asking questions that I could no longer ignore. Mommy, is Daddy coming back? Of course, sweetie. He's just busy. Doesn't he love you anymore? Her question was like a punch in the gut. Lisa, Daddy, and I will always love you and Tom. That's the most important thing. She just nodded, but her eyes filled with tears. I took her in my arms, trying to keep her world from shattering. But how could I hold it together if I destroyed everything myself? A week later, I received a letter. It was short, written in Mark's hand, but every word cut into me like a knife. Laura, I thought I knew you. But you've turned out to be a stranger. I can't see you around our children anymore. I will take them away to be raised in a stable and healthy family. You can fight, but I'll do anything to make sure you lose. Those words were the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I remembered how he had saved Tom when he almost fell out of the boat on the lake. I screamed in terror, and Mark instantly jumped in and pulled my son out. He sat with Tom in his arms for a long time afterward, comforting him. You're the best father ever, I said then, and it was true, but now I've ruined even that. I've robbed my children of the opportunity to see what an example their father can be. Mark began formal divorce proceedings, and I had to contact a lawyer. Laura, tell me honestly, is there any chance that Mark can prove your inability to be a mother? The lawyer asked. I didn't know what to say. Could the judges know the whole truth? It will all depend on how far he is willing to go. He added, I knew Mark was willing to do anything. That night, Jake tried to talk to me again. Laura, you have to understand that we're both to blame, but you can start over. Go away, Jake, I said. You know, he said, heading for the door, you've been living in his shadow for too long. His words didn't matter anymore. I've already ruined everything. Mark's shadow wasn't the problem. The problem was myself. The snow lay a dense carpet on the ground, hiding traces of the past. I sat by the window with a mug of tea in my hands, but even its aroma couldn't warm me. All I could see in front of me was an empty yard and a snow-covered entryway. Life was divided into before and after. The before seemed like a pipe dream, almost a fairy tale that I had destroyed. And after was a cold reality in which I was alone. I realize now that payback is inevitable. But can I even fix anything? It's been a month since Mark took the kids. Every day I called him, texted him, but it was all in vain. His silence tore me apart. The house was empty. The rooms that once filled with Lisa and Tom's laughter were now just echoes of my loneliness. I sat in their rooms for hours, going through toys, books, clothes. One day I came across an album of photographs. In one of them, we were all standing together by the lake. Lisa was smiling, Tom was waving at the camera, and Mark was holding me by the shoulders. Tears began to roll down my cheeks, blurring the image before my eyes. I remembered our trip to the mountains when Lisa had just learned to walk. We got lost and I started to panic, but Mark remained calm. We'll find our way, Laura, he said then. I will never let anything happen to our family. He did find his way. He always did, until I ruined everything. Sarah came to see me a few weeks after Mark had left. Her face was stern, but there was pity in her eyes. Laura, you have to do something. You can't just sit here and wait. What can I do? He took the children. He hates me. you have to show that you're still their mother. Prove that you're ready to change. Her words struck a chord with me. Do you think he'll believe me? It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that you do. The next day I decided to write a letter to Mark. Mark, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. I know I ruined everything we had. But please don't take away my opportunity to be a mother to Lisa and Tom. They're the only thing I have left. I realize I don't deserve them, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove I can do better. I decided to seek counseling. It wasn't an easy step, but Sarah insisted. Do you feel guilty, Laura? Dr. Anderson asked me at the first session. Of course I do. Every day, but are you really ready to make a change? Or do you just want to get back what you've lost? Her question got me thinking. I wanted my family back, but what did I do to deserve it? 2 months later, Mark let me see the kids. It was a brief meeting in the presence of his attorney. Lisa ran up to me and hugged me, and her tears began to soak my coat. Tom, on the other hand, kept a wary expression, as if he wasn't sure if I could be a part of his world. Why did you leave? Lisa asked quietly. I made a mistake, sweetheart, I answered, feeling my throat tighten, but explanations weren't enough. I remembered Mark's birthday party for her when she turned 5. He baked the cake himself, though he'd never done it before, and decorated it with marzipan figures. Did Daddy do that? Lisa asked then, looking at the cake with delight. Yes, sweetie, I replied. Now she will no longer be able to see how caring her father was. All she'll remember is our breakup. Jake reappeared, unexpected as always. Laura, you can blame Mark for taking the children without your consent. I can help. Do you really think I need your intervention? You put yourself in this situation? I'm just offering a way out, but I knew that a way out would only lead to more destruction. At the custody hearing, Mark looked calm, but his gaze was not kind. I'm asking the court to keep the kids with me, he said. I don't trust Laura to raise them. I presented the judge with a letter Lisa had written. In it, she asked to be allowed to see me. It was a turning point. I've lost everything: love, respect, trust. But I can't lose my children. They are the only thing that gives me the strength to go on. I will do anything to prove to Mark that I can be a good mother, even if he never forgives me as a wife. The court ruled that the children would stay with Mark, but I would be able to see them every month. It was painful, but better than being completely alone. Now my life consists of short meetings with my children, working on myself, and being alone. Mark is no longer.